Tagalong Bride, Chapter 1. June 1885, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. It was Lucas Alexander Reed's wedding day, and it was the worst day of his life. He sat in the small room of the church, face in his hands, waiting for the preacher to tell him it was time for the wedding to begin. He had extended the engagement for as long as he could, but his family was running out of money, and the creditors were breathing down his neck. A knock came at the door. He straightened up in the chair and took a deep breath. This was it. His hour had come. From this moment forward, he would be Gail Patterson's husband. He shuddered. The knock came again. "I'm coming," he called out. He stood up and, as if preparing for war, pushed his shoulders back before he opened the door. Instead of the preacher, however, he saw his lawyer. Surprised, he peered around the lawyer to make sure he was alone. As it turned out, he was. "Has the wedding been called off?" Lucas asked, his tone hopeful despite the rational part of him starting to panic. The lawyer entered the room and shut the door to ensure their privacy. "No. The bride is getting ready as we speak." He turned to him. "You're doing a good thing for your mother. She doesn't know about the condition your father left the business in when he died. I know this decision wasn't easy for you, but it really is the right one." With a nod, Lucas returned to his chair. "I don't have any other options. All of the creditors want the money before the year is up, and I can't do this unless I get married." He paused. "No one else knows the truth, do they?" The lawyer shook his head. "I have kept your financial position a secret. Your family's standing in the community is still sound." Good. He'd hate to think what a disaster it would be if the others, especially his mother, found out. The lawyer pulled up a chair and sat next to him. "You'll be happy to know Miss Patterson's family is as well off as they appear. I'll make sure your father's creditors will be paid off by the end of the day. You'll have enough left over to get your family's business in good order and see to your mother's comfort. I know you're not looking forward to this marriage, but it will serve its purpose." Well, that was good news at least. He had secured his sister's future by sending her out to Arizona to marry a successful rancher, and this marriage would take care of the rest of his problems. Lucas wiped his sweaty hands on his breeches. "Marriage isn't so bad," the lawyer said, "especially not among the wealthy. The husband and wife have separate bedrooms. The wife is used to her husband being gone most of the day. Sometimes he doesn't even have to show up for dinner because of business. Think of this union as a business arrangement, where you only have to see your wife once in a while, and, on occasion, try for a child." It took significant willpower, but Lucas managed to hide his grimace. He realized that the marital bed was supposed to be something a man looked forward to. He wasn't made of stone. There were plenty of ladies who appealed to him. If they had been available, he would have wanted to pursue them in hopes that he might, one day, share the marital bed with him. But none of those ladies were available. Never in a million years could he imagine wanting to make love to Gail. What he needed was a job that would take him on many overnight trips. Another knock came at the door. The lawyer rose to his feet and gave his shoulder a fatherly pat. "I'll get it." This time, the preacher was at the door. The guests were seated. The violinist, the fluteist, and the organist were ready. The bride was waiting for her cue to go down the aisle. All the preacher needed was the groom. Resolute, Lucas stood up and straightened his suit jacket. This was it. The moment had come to seal his fate. He closed his eyes and reminded himself that he was doing this for his mother and the future of the family business. He left the room and went into the sanctuary, making sure he had put on the face that people expected to see whenever he was in public. Polite, pleasant, confident, happy. This was no small affair. Many were in attendance. Most of them were there because of the social circles that he and Gail were in. Not showing up would risk disfavor among the prominent members of Philadelphia. Gail's family was one of the oldest, richest, and influential families in the area. Being new money, Luke was lucky that his father had managed to charm enough of them so that they would let him into their crowd. Lucas reached the altar, and everyone's attention went to the preacher, who came up in the aisle after him. Since no one was watching him, Lucas took out the handkerchief from his pocket and wiped the sweat from his forehead. So much was riding on this wedding. He took his spot next to the preacher and slipped the handkerchief back into his pocket. "A lot of grooms get nervous right before the ceremony," the preacher whispered to him. "Don't worry. Once the ceremony starts, you'll feel better." Lucas doubted it, but it was nice for the preacher to say it. The preacher gave a signal to Gail's father, who was waiting in the doorway of the foyer. Her father gave a nod and went to get her. Lucas took a deep breath. This wasn't a dream. It was really happening. He glanced at his mother, who sat in the front pew with her good friends from the sewing group. His mother dabbed tears from her eyes, but smiled at him. He returned her smile. It was best that she didn't know how much this wedding mattered. She believed, just like everyone else did, that he loved Gail. The violinist, flutist, and organist began the music that instructed the bridesmaids and the groomsmen to come down the aisle. There were 14 of those in all, and it did make for a tight fit around the altar, but it was prudent that all 7 bridesmaids and 7 groomsmen were allowed to be a part of the wedding party, lest one of the influential families get upset. The maid of honor and the best man followed. Those were the only 2 people that he and Gail were allowed to pick without upsetting anyone. The ring bearer and the flower girl came after that. Finally, there was a moment of silence that hung in the air as everyone waited for the bride. Lucas entertained the fantasy that Gail had changed her mind, but quickly shoved it aside. If she changed her mind, it would be a disaster. He needed her family's money in the worst way. He held his breath. When Gail and her father appeared at the end of the aisle, Lucas breathed a sigh of relief. He almost pulled out his handkerchief again, but managed to restrain himself. There was no sense in drawing undue attention to himself. He would just let the sweat trickle down his forehead. "You don't need to worry," Alfred, Gail's cousin, whispered in his ear. "Gail's hopelessly in love with you. She wouldn't miss this for anything." Lucas gave him the happiest smile he could muster, then turned his gaze back to Gail and her father. The violinist, the flutist, and the organist began to play "Here Comes the Bride," and the guests rose to their feet. Lucas had to admit that the gown Gail was wearing was astonishing. Her parents had mentioned getting her something that would be the envy of every lady in Philadelphia, and they had succeeded. The veil Gail had over her face was even better. He knew it was wrong to think that, but this wedding would be easier if he didn't have to see her face. It wasn't that she was ugly. It was just that there were a lot more ladies out there who were prettier than she was. He hated thinking that, but what good was it to lie to himself? There was a reason no one else bothered to court her. A few people, including Mrs. Courtney and Mrs. Bain, whispered to each other as her father escorted her down the aisle, and by the way they smiled, they were satisfied with the whole wedding. Lucas bet this wedding would be mentioned in the next day's newspaper. Mrs. Baines was married to the editor, and if she wanted something featured in the paper, her husband would see to it that it was featured. Lucas had to admit that Gail's family spared no expense on the ceremony. Lucas hadn't been privy to exactly how much this thing cost, but he recalled her father saying it was a pittance compared to how much money he had. It must be nice to have so much money that this elaborate affair didn't make a dent in his bank account. When Gail and her father reached him, the preacher asked, "Who gives Miss Gail Patterson to be married to Mr. Lucas Reed?" "I do," her father said, then winked at Lucas. Lucas had originally thought that Mr. Patterson was just glad someone was marrying his daughter, but perhaps Mr. Patterson actually liked the idea of having him for a son-in-law. Lucas's father barely knew Mr. Patterson. Lucas had only gotten to know him because he'd been determined to marry Gail. And, as he thought about it, he did enjoy being around Mr. Patterson. Unlike some, Mr. Patterson struck him as someone who was down to earth and honest. As Mr. Patterson went to sit with his wife, the preacher gestured for Lucas to hold Gail's hand. Holding her hand wasn't a problem. It was the part of the ceremony where he had to kiss her that he worried about. He hadn't kissed her yet, even though during their courtship she had hinted she would allow him to steal one if he wanted. Thankfully, the chaperone her father had hired made it less awkward when he told her that they should wait until they were married. Well, there'd be no getting out of this kiss with her anymore. After everyone was seated, the preacher began. The older I get, the more I'm convinced that love is the most beautiful thing in the world. It is a gift given by God Himself. In this fallen world, man faces many trials and tribulations. If he has no one to lean on, no one to share those burdens with, no one to offer comfort, life becomes unbearable. God, in His infinite wisdom, created woman to ease the burdens life gives man. And when God does something, He never does it halfway. He gives it the very best. Eve was not taken from Adam's head to be superior to him, nor was she taken from his foot to be inferior to him. She was taken from his rib. That's the place closest to his heart. She was meant to be his equal. She was meant to walk with him all the days of his life. Her part wasn't just to help him through the trials and tribulations that inevitably came his way, but she was also there for him to love and cherish. Through her, he was complete. For in her, he experienced the greatest of all God's gifts, love. We are gathered here today to join Lucas Reed and Gail Patterson in holy matrimony. From this moment forward, the two will be united as one in the eyes of God and the state. We might live in a fallen world, but we don't have to go through this life alone. Lucas, the good book says whoever finds a wife finds a good thing. Gail, the good book also encourages the wife to be the helpmeet her husband needs. The preacher opened the Bible and began his reading that he had selected for the ceremony. Lucas ignored the twinge of guilt that pricked him. He had a responsibility to see to his mother's needs, and the last thing the poor lady needed was to be tossed out of her home. She also didn't need the stigma of being bankrupt, nor did Lucas want her to find out the truth about his father's debts. She had a fulfilling life here in Philadelphia. She had been a good mother to him and his sister. Rather than having servants take them off of her hands, his mother had chosen to be a part of their lives while growing up. She'd been the one who took them for walks and to the shops. She'd been the one who read them bedtime stories. She'd been the one who took care of them when they were sick. Now it was his turn to take care of her. While the good book lauded the virtues of marriage, it also taught people to honor their parents. Besides, it wasn't like this was a great sacrifice. This marriage is going to benefit him as much as it was going to benefit his mother. Once he paid off the creditors and invested the money left over in the business, he'd have everything money could buy at his disposal. Marrying Gail meant he would never have to go through those trials and tribulations the preacher had mentioned. All he had to do was play the role of the doting husband, and he only had to do that when he had to spend time with Gail. As the lawyer had pointed out, there were plenty of things men did apart from their wives. Why, he'd just been invited to join an exclusive gentleman's club because of his newfound connection to the Patterson family. Yes, his life would be one of ease. He really ought to be grateful to Gail for bailing him out of the mess his father had gotten him into. The preacher closed the Bible, then opened the Book of Common Prayer. Feeling much better about the marriage, Lucas recited the vows, word for word. After Gail recited the vows, Lucas slipped a ring on her finger. The ring had been passed down in his mother's family for the past 3 generations. His mother had said that she wanted him to give it to Gail so she could continue the tradition. "You made a wonderful choice in picking her," his mother told him. "It'd be my honor to let her have it." And it was a blessing his mother had this in her possession, because he could not afford a ring. The ring wasn't that expensive, but it was a family heirloom. As such, everyone would find it acceptable. Once the ring was on Gail's finger, the preacher encouraged Lucas to kiss her. This was it, the first kiss. Lucas had put this off during their courtship. He couldn't delay it any more. He steadied himself and lifted the veil. He noted that Gail had taken considerable time in making herself pretty for the day. Though she still couldn't come close to the other ladies in their social circle, he could appreciate the effort she'd made. She had porcelain skin, gray eyes, nice cheekbones, and dark hair. There was nothing wrong with her, really. She just didn't stand out. He closed his eyes and bowed his head to kiss her. Thankfully, he was allowed to keep this one short. He was done within a second. It was just as he had expected, not the least bit exciting. He had held out for the possibility that kissing her would create a spark, but it didn't. Apparently, attraction wasn't something he could will into existence. Forcing aside his disappointment, he smiled at her. She returned his smile, and by the way she smiled, he could tell that she had felt a spark he hadn't. He had to ignore this twist of guilt in his gut in order to go through with the rest of the ceremony without apologizing to her. When they were done lighting the candle, the preacher offered a final blessing, then said, "Everyone, I present to you Mr. and Mrs. Lucas Reed." The preacher motioned for him to escort Gail down the aisle, so he did. On his way to the foyer, he overheard someone gushing on and on about how the wedding had been such a lovely affair. Like a fairy tale. Lucas sighed. This wedding could be called many things, but a fairy tale wasn't one of them.